Ever feel like, those stories that sound like they're straight out of a movie, like ripped from the headlines, are the ones we actually need to hear most?
Absolutely the ones that really stay with you.
Yeah, and that's what we're diving into today. Saudi princesses, a Texan doctor, a whole lot of mystery.
It's a story that shines a light, a really uncomfortable light, on what happens when, well, when powerful people want to keep things quiet.
We're talking the Texan doctor and the disappeared Saudi princesses. That's the expose we're digging into. And get this, our guide is the doctor himself, Dr. Dwight Burdick. He spent years working for the Saudi royal family.
Talk about a front row seat to a world most of us can't even fathom.
Exactly. Okay, so picture this. It's the mid-90s, Saudi Arabia, everyone's talking about modernization, right? And King Abdullah, he's like the poster boy for reform, especially for women's rights.
On the surface, at least.
Exactly. Appearances can be deceiving, but that's where this story cracks things wide open.
It really exposes the gap between, the image and the reality for some women, even within Abdullah's own family.
Okay, so Dr. Burdick, our Texan doctor, he gets this seemingly amazing opportunity, move to Saudi Arabia, train young doctors at this prestigious hospital in Riyadh.
He's excited, understandably, about the work, the culture, the whole experience.
Totally. And at first, he's blown away by the generosity, the welcome from the royal family. His wife, Susan, even gets exceptional care when she's diagnosed with cervical cancer.
So he feels indebted, right? Which makes what he discovers later even more, well, unsettling.
Oh, for sure. So he's assigned to King Abdullah's own medical team, and he starts to notice something's off about 4 of the king's daughters, Sahar, Maha, Jawahir, and Hala.
These princesses, daughters of the king and his wife, Alanad al-Fayez, they're, for lack of a better term, locked away.
In this, luxury villa on the palace grounds.
Yeah, but still, their mom had actually escaped years earlier, fled to London. She called Abdullah controlling, and she hoped her daughters could join her.
She wanted them to have a chance at freedom. Instead, it's like...
Yielded cage, right.
Exactly. And that's where things take a dark turn. So Dr. Burdick, he's now responsible for these princesses' medical care. And what he finds is shocking. They're being given, routinely dosed with these powerful tranquilizers.
And not for any legitimate medical reason.
No. He knows, as a doctor, these aren't therapeutic doses. This is about control. This is about keeping them quiet.
Imagine being in his position. Talk about an ethical nightmare.
Right. Refuse, and who knows what happens. Comply, and he's part of the problem. What would you even do?
He chooses to comply, but he also decides, I'm going to use my access to try to help, to figure out what's going on.
Okay, so that's how his bond, particularly with Princess Hala, the second youngest, that's how that starts.
She sees him as this lifeline to the outside.
And they would use loud music as cover, right? To talk, to evade the constant surveillance.
And through those conversations, Hala's personality, her intelligence, her desire for a life she can't have, it just shines through.
It's heartbreaking, really, because she was outspoken. She challenged her father's views, advocated for the poor, spoke out against abuses.
Which, experts say that would not have gone over well. Seen as a direct threat to the king's power, to the image of Saudi Arabia itself.
And it wasn't just Hala. Sahar, the eldest, she also spoke out against injustices.
And what happens? Confinement. It's a way to silence them, to maintain that facade of control.
And Dr. Burdick is watching this all unfold. He sees the physical confinement, but also the psychological toll it's taking.
They turn to, substance abuse to cope, fueled by the very drugs he's pressured to prescribe.
It's a lot. And he feels so helpless.
He tries to help, though, even suggests they seek treatment abroad. But it falls on deaf ears.
It's like this brutal reality check. Here's a man who wants to do good, to make a difference. But he's up against this massive controlling system.
And then things escalate in 2014. 2 of the princesses, Sahar and Jawahir, they actually managed to get a message out to journalists. Can you believe it?
Channel 4 News in London, right?
Yeah, Channel 4. And it becomes this, pivotal moment in their story. They choose to break the silence themselves.
To risk everything and expose what's happening.
It took immense courage.
You have to wonder, what led to that decision,
Well, they'd been silenced for so long. And their mother had been fighting for them from London all these years, trying to raise awareness.
So they had that support, but it was still incredibly risky.
Absolutely. But their story, combined with their mother's advocacy, it finally, poked a hole in that wall of secrecy.
They gave these detailed accounts of their captivity. The forced medication, the psychological abuse, the fact that they were under constant surveillance, it was really harrowing stuff.
The world is suddenly paying attention. You've got the UN getting involved, there's public outcry, and the pressure on the Saudi government is immense.
But instead of, acknowledging it, take your responsibility.
Leverage control.
Yeah, the palace basically calls it a private family matter.
But behind closed doors, it's a different story, a much darker one.
Dr. Burdick, he sees it firsthand. The retaliation is swift and it's brutal. Conditions for Sahar and Jawahar, they get even worse after they speak out.
They're punished for daring to tell the truth.
Their food is restricted, their access to water even. Imagine that, being slowly deprived of the essentials.
It's chilling, and it reveals just how far those in power are willing to go to silence dissent.
So Dr. Burdick, he's watching this, and he's horrified. And he decides, okay, I have to do something, anything.
So he starts smuggling food in to the princesses.
Putting himself at risk, risking everything, really. But he can't stand by and do nothing.
He's trying to hold on to that shred of hope, that he can make some small difference in their lives.
But it's tough, right? Because even with his help, they're still trapped. But Sahar and Jawahar, they're incredibly resilient. They find ways to keep getting messages out.
Sending photos even that show just how bad things are.
And these photos, they're hard to look at. They show their declining health, how desperate they are.
There's even these, almost surreal images of things they've created. A water distiller, a makeshift fishing hook. Trying to survive, to take some control back in this impossible situation.
And meanwhile, their mother in London, she never gives up. She's petitioning the UN, protesting, trying to keep the pressure on the Saudi government.
And these efforts, they do have some impact. The UN issues a statement, expresses grave concern about the allegations.
But it's not enough.
No. The Saudi government stays silent. It's like they're untouchable.
Imagine the crushing disappointment. All that courage, all that effort, and for what? Then, in 2015, King Abdullah dies.
You'd think that might change things, right?
It's this moment of, what's going to happen now?
But instead there's this eerie silence. The princesses, they completely disappear from any kind of communication.
Their mother, understandably, she stops her public campaign, fears for her own safety, I'm sure.
Even Dr. Burdick, who's still inside the palace at this point, he hits a wall, he tries to ask about them, and he's told flat out nothing will change.
Just like that, their fate is sealed.
Dr. Burdick is allowed to keep seeing Hala and Maha, though. They're isolated now, in separate villas.
And what he finds is devastating. They're not the same.
Years of this, it's taken its toll, they're broken.
Hala, who was so full of fire, fighting for what she believed in, she retreats into herself, starts using those same drugs they used to control her, but this time it's to escape.
And Maha, who was already struggling, the isolation it breaks her.
It's like the world forgets about them. Their story fades from the headlines, everyone moves on, but they're still trapped. And then there's this detail, it really gets to me. Before he died, King Abdullah, he gives Hala this gift, a Bentley.
A luxury car? Seems generous, I guess, on the surface.
Right, but here's the catch. She can only drive it on the circular driveway of her villa.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Talk about a metaphor.
It's like the ultimate symbol of her reality, right? Surrounded by these trappings of wealth and privilege, but absolutely no real freedom. And Dr. Burdick, he sees all of this, and you can tell it weighs on him.
He carries that weight for years. Leaves Saudi Arabia, goes back to the U.S., but those princesses, their stories, they stay with him.
And then, in 2021, news breaks. Princess Hala has died. She wasn't even 50 years old.
The official statement was incredibly vague, some kind of chronic illness.
Which, of course, just raises more questions, right? Given everything we know. And then, 6 months later,
Princess Maha is gone too.
2 lives gone. Silenced. It's hard not to feel, angry, frustrated. Like, what was it all for?
Their death, as tragic as they were, it did bring renewed attention to Dr. Burdick's story. It's like it forced him to finally say something.
Which is huge, considering what happened to Jamal Khashoggi, right? Speaking out against the Saudi regime, it's dangerous.
Incredibly. But Dr. Burdick, he chose to speak out, to honor their memory, to make sure their story was heard.
And it's a story that needs to be heard, because it reminds us that behind the palaces, behind the carefully crafted images, there are real people, real lives being impacted.
And sometimes, those lives are being silenced.
This story, it peels back those layers of power, reveals a much darker reality. It's a reminder that these things are still happening, and it forces us to ask ourselves, what's our responsibility when we see injustice? Do we stay silent? or do we speak up?
It's a question we all have to grapple with.
Absolutely. And it makes you wonder how many other stories like this are out there. How many voices are still waiting to be heard? It's a lot to unpack, but that's the power of a story like this. It stays with you, makes you think. And hopefully it sparks conversations that need to be had.